Welcome to the GOTO podcast. In this episode, Drew and Adam Tornhill discuss the correlations between factors such as team size, structures, diversity, and healthy retrospectives on both code quality and effectiveness. Created for developers by developers, GOTO gathers the best minds in the software community. Stay up to date with the latest in tech through GOTO's top-rated events held online and in person in Chicago, Amsterdam, and Copenhagen, and by subscribing to the GOTO Conferences YouTube channel, where you can find thousands more high-quality dev talks. Learn more at gotopia.tech.
My name is Drew. I've been working in software, in the kind of software industry, in a whole bunch of different roles for about 20 years. Spent a lot of that as a software engineer, and then sort of the last decade I've sort of slowly moved from being more of a technical consultant to then being more of an agile coach, and then slowly moving far more into looking into the way we manage teams and lead teams of software engineers than necessarily the hands-on engineering. But I still do a fair bit of all of that as well. My talk this time was looking at collaborative product ownership. So it was looking at how we tend to have, I think it's a bit of a this weird thing where I think in engineering we recognize that that having like a single engineer that knows all about all of the systems and and you have the bus problem, that's known as being a really bad idea, but apparently it's completely okay and is apparently best practice even to have like a single product owner that knows all of the business knowledge for the application, but there's no challenge there. So it's kind of looking at how maybe the whole team can be involved with that product ownership and that you can share that role. So that was me.
All right. So I'm Adam Tornhill. I'm the founder of Ampere, where I develop code analysis tools. So that's one of my big interests. I'm also the author of Software Design X-Rays and Your Code as a Crime Scene on similar topics. And this time I spoke about prioritizing technical depth as if time and money mattered, which happens to be one of my big fascinations. So what I think I do differently when prioritizing technical depth is that I tend to emphasize organizational factors and social factors like teamwork over any properties of the code. So that's pretty much me.
Has that changed over I don't know how many recent years? We tend to work more remotely and on a global scale now. Does that reflect in technical depth, in the code quality?
Yes, I think it definitely does. So I've seen a very clear trend. So I think in general, many software projects, they are getting larger and larger software. We are building ever larger software systems. And what I tend to see is that we make many technical depth decisions, many decisions to redesign and refactor based on properties of the code, technical properties. But I do think that when we're talking about software development at scale, factors like system mastery and team coupling, they should also be drivers of redesign and refactorings to align the organization and the architecture. And it's something I don't see happen that often, unfortunately.
I think that for me, an area that I work with a lot is teams and their retrospectives. And one of the interesting things you will see is the very, very common symptom of teams is that they go into their retrospective, they have their little moan about how awful everything is. They come out with some, hopefully they come out with some ideas for how they might change that. And then 2 weeks later, they go back into the room for a retrospective and they complain about how awful everything is. And they come out with the same set of things to change. And one of I find the fascinating thing is that, and this goes back to actually the topic of your talk, is that you'll often have we just can't get fixing the build or improving the speed of the build or dealing with that area of really poor code coverage or dealing with whatever the issue might be. We just can't get that prioritized over delivering stuff. And I go, but those things are the things stopping you from delivering stuff. They're the reason why you failed to hit that last deadline, isn't that right? And well, yeah, but they just don't understand. I said, but you've told them that. I'm like, yeah. And And you'll have these conversations, these conversations where it's like, so with the product owners a lot of the time, you say, well, so the team, you've been in the retrospective and the team have told you these are the things that they consider to be the most important things to them, the biggest reasons that are stopping them from delivering to your expectations. And you're not prioritizing those things. And it's always seemed to be this it's a very odd thing where there's a lack of trust, I think, between the engineering team. And I actually think that goes back to my talk, which is around the kind of historical links to Taylorism and Taylor and this basic idea of this division between the worker and the thinker, as Taylor would describe himself, slightly arrogantly.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. So I've seen the same situation many times myself, of course. And what I find fascinating is that I have this hypothesis that that situation that you describe is much more likely in a larger team. Because I do think it has something to do with team size, because then you run the risk of running into things like diffusion of responsibility, which social psychologists love to talk about.
Yeah.
One of the things I know you care very much about is psychological safety. That the team should be a safe environment for me as a junior to express my feelings and meanings about what we're doing. But still, I feel like doing retrospectives, it's like establishing that room once for a very short time, every 2 weeks. If I was in a team with all this in place, would I need these retrospectives?
I think Linda Rising, who's also speaking, she talks quite a bit on the topic of continuous retrospectives. I think there's value in both things. So I think that something I've started doing a lot was I was getting fed up with a particular team. Well, I get fed up with teams that moan all the time in their retrospectives. You go into a retro and they spend the entire 2 hours moaning about how awful everything is. And a lot of the time I remember just saying, but look, that thing that you're moaning about, like you knew about that, 9 days ago. Why didn't you start fixing that then? Why wait until now to deal with it? So we had an agreement with them that essentially when they raise an impediment, if they face an impediment, we would stick it up on the board and they would start to focus on it right then. So, whether it's an issue with the test. So what was quite nice was after about, I think it was somewhere between 3 or 4 weeks worth of work, we actually realized they came into a retro and they didn't have anything really negative to talk about, not kind of technical things, there was some other stuff. But really it was a really positive retro. So we decided that the 2 weekly retro that we had would be an entirely positive occasion after that point. So we deal with all the negative stuff beforehand and we use this as a 2-hour session to talk about, as Woody Zill would talk about, I think he was at GOTO Berlin this year, turn up the good, and I think that became a really nice cycle for that particular team, was that we actually began to change that. And so I kind of agree and I disagree. I think that there's a real value in that cadence of a 2 weekly retrospective, of actually having the time to come in, and even if all you're doing is using that time to focus on celebrating your successes, that's really valuable. Mm-hmm. But
that you can do on a daily basis too.
And you absolutely can, but there's something wonderful about making it a special occasion.
A ceremony.
It's like you know what, you can tell your wife, your partner, that you love them, every day of the year if you want to, but there's still something special about taking them out for their birthday, or saying that on Valentine's Day. You make a ceremony out of it, and I think that gives it more potency in some respects. But I do think I definitely agree that in an ideal world, you almost make that the session for the only point of, fixing things. It becomes superfluous,
Has any of you ever been in a team where you said, I've tried everything, this simply doesn't work out, I pack my stuff and I leave?
I've come very close a few times. Definitely. I haven't given up yet. But it definitely happens. But in my experience, that tended to be much more common like 20 years ago when I started out with professional development. And that was still back in the day of the traditional waterfall approach, and that could be extremely frustrating at times with the delayed feedback loops.
Yeah.
So things are definitely, even though we might complain a lot about the state of software development, but I do think we have made significant improvements in the past 2 decades.
I completely agree. I think that even though there's some of the biggest challenges with kind of agile adoption or moves to different mindsets there's lots of companies, doing the ceremonies, doing the things, having the stand-ups, but not really operating in any way that could be described as operating with agility. And while that's frustrating, even just the slight move in that direction allows for a lot more breathing space than it did 20 years ago, certainly from my memory anyway. It's a lot better than it was.
You often hear that we should strive to make our teams as diverse as possible in any sense. Can a team be too diverse?
I don't think so. I think that that diversity of thought is fairly critical to solving problems, and the greater heterogeneity you have in any group, the greater abilities to observe a problem from different perspectives you have. Yeah. And as well, certainly we're at GOTOs, these are engineering teams, they're all doing creative problem solving, so that's the thing you want to focus on. But I would say that with the skill that we seem to lack in most organizations is facilitation. And you need good facilitation to support and create positive conflict, because there will be positive, good, creative conflict in those settings. And if it's not well supported and you don't engage people, you won't get anywhere near as an effective outcome as you might want to.
That's a brilliant way to put it. Positive conflict. Adam, I see you as kind of Mr. Technical Debt in a positive way. have you
created my friend.
Have you ever done any statistics on how the composition of the team reflects in the quality of what we do?
So to a certain degree, yes. So I tend to focus, when I do my analysis and my research, I tend to focus mostly on the team level. I very rarely look at individuals and how they compose into teams, simply because I think the team level is most interesting. What I have seen is a very positive correlation with shorter lead times and throughput and small teams. So that's one of the things I'm looking into more and more these days. And I think a small team is much smaller than we would like to think. So what I see is that teams work best when they are as small as 3 to just 4 people, because that helps you avoid a lot of not only coordination overhead, but also a lot of motivation losses that easily occur as soon as a team grows just a little bit bigger.
Yeah, so small it's almost not a team.
It is a team. I think what tends to happen is that when you get slightly larger team, we can speak about just 8-9 people. What you get is no longer a team. You get a bunch of individuals with largely artificial organizational boundaries around them. It's incredibly hard to keep a team together of a larger size, in my experience.
Do you think companies should learn from that, from not just building development teams, but the way we divide companies in departments?
Yes, I think that's actually, I think it's vital. So all this stuff I've been saying with small teams, what that basically means is that the only way to scale is by scaling by having lots of really, really autonomous teams. And in order to pull that off, you need to align it with not only the software architecture, but also the overall business structure of your company. And that's an area where I think and hope we will see a lot of improvements over the next years.
I think that the structure of it's a very interesting point around the smaller teams there. You got me thinking. I think that something I've seen a lot is that I've worked with a lot of companies where they have very, very large, very legacy systems, and they will often have, you know, upwards of 100 people at least working on the system. Now, they're not in one big team as such, but what I've seen a lot of is how teams or organizations start to divide up that work and those people. You end up with epic amounts of friction between those teams, whatever that might be. And that actually happens very naturally. There's a kind of an evolutionary bias for us. We like working in small groups, and that's great. We have this kind of very natural ability to form that, and we form very cohesive groups very, very quickly. But there's I think it's Stanley McChrystal in the book Team of Teams. He's the guy that headed up the Joint Task Force in Iraq, and he talks about how when he started with them, essentially the squads or the edges of their equivalent of teams was outside of that boundary was where everyone else sucked. So you're in a team and everyone else is terrible. And I see that a lot. And something that I've seen is that the other challenge is that actually what you have is from a code quality perspective, if you're all essentially working on the same code base, you've got 100 people kind of working on the same code base, then you naturally have lots of integration challenges between the teams. And something I've experimented with some companies is actually saying, well, technically, rather than artificially split you all up and have lots of channels of work, we say, allow you as a team to group yourselves around the piece of work naturally. So technically there's one big team of 100 people, but the work comes through, there's a single backlog, and they say, okay, we're going to form small groups of 4 or 5 people, let's say, often not much more than that, around this piece of work that might last a month or maybe even less than that. And they kind of form and then they disband and they move around that. But I've actually found that to be quite effective. So you keep the people working close together quite small, but you don't you lose that kind of issue. There's lots of rotation around those groups, so it means you don't have the issues of, you know, one team following completely different coding style standards than other teams, which sometimes happens, or other teams having very undisciplined approaches to testing before they push up to the build server and stopping the entire department. So you can end up with some quite it's kind of like a combination of saying, actually, technically the team's got 100 people in it, but in reality, that there's never more than, 4 to 6, I think was probably the largest group we had, working together at once for any length of time. But I found that to be quite effective. But I mean, saying that the code base on that particular project was at quite a bad state to begin with, so it was hard to.
And I think that's where we as an industry have a lot of learning to do, because we are pretty good at the technical aspects of software architecture, but we are not doing a particularly good job at organizing software architectures according to boundaries of the teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you have that misalignment, that's when things start to become really, really expensive.
Was it Conway's law, reverse Conway's law?
Yeah,
kind of.
There's a lot of truth to it. There's this very good research from, I think it's from Microsoft Research, where they point out that organizational factors like the number of developers that work in parallel on a piece of code are better predictors of quality issues than any properties of the code itself.
I mean, I think that you mentioned my love of psychological safety, and obviously Google did their Project Aristotle study, and it basically demonstrated that there are these 5 indicators around specific psychological safety being the critical one that demonstrated the kind of effectiveness of their teams. Now, this wasn't just software teams, but amazingly, when they were looking at software teams, if you had 2 teams, you might assume that, Team A is doing really well and Team B is not doing very well, that maybe Team A had more competent engineers and more experienced engineers. But that wasn't true in any of their studies. Essentially, you could take a team of 5 mid-level or even junior engineers, and they could be more effective at delivering against expectations than a team of 5 senior engineers that had low levels of psychological safety in the team, and they weren't communicating effectively. And I think that there's still a huge amount of research to do in that space, because I don't think we've really, the work of Amy Edmondson and other people looking into it, but I think that we've kind of only scratched the surface of something that's to me, that's incredibly profound, to suggest that, to demonstrably, with research, demonstrate that you take a group of people that by all objective facts would say that these people are more effective and more experienced engineers than this group of people, that this group are more likely to be effective even though they have less experience, for a bunch of apparently unrelated traits. It seems kind of mind-blowing to me. Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah. I think we could go on forever here, but we have plenty of stuff already. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the GOTO podcast. Head over to gotopia.tech for lots more content from the brightest minds in software development.